I have this battery-powered eraser that erases in this kind of very shaky, random motion. And I like to use that to sort of build up. I'll build up layers of charcoal and chalk and pastel and things like that, and then erase them back with this kind of random motion from the eraser, and then build up other areas, where it's a little bit darker, maybe I'll accentuate that darkness, and where it's lighter, maybe I'll erase away some of the lightness and put some gouache on top of it, and sort of build up these patterns out of this underlying sense of randomness. So in a way, it's a little bit like our world, where we have this layer of kind of quantum randomness underpinning everything, but that's not necessarily visible in our day-to-day lives. We see a very orderly, for the most part, universe with our eyes, but underneath all of that is this entire universe within the universe where everything is, basically a roll of a dice or a flip of a coin. Everything is, based on randomness and probabilities, as opposed to things that are necessarily predictable.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Creativity Worth Expressing. I'm your host, Ryan Anthony Hernandez, and today I'm here with special guest, Roman Kalinowski, the Kalinova. Roman, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get started, actually, can you share with the audience where you were coming from?
We are recording this today at my mother's place in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. I'm mostly based out of Brooklyn, but I've been helping her out with some medical issues recently. So I have sort of my a makeshift studio here in her place, and my main studio is in Brooklyn at the Army Terminal with Chashama, which is really wonderful group of artists. It's maybe it's got to be 60-something studios in the area where I work in the Army Terminal. It's a great community. I just moved in over the summer, and I really do quite miss it. I've been here in the woods for a little while, and it's a little bit lonelier out here. Instead of having 60 studios on the floor, there's exactly one, and it's kind of thrown together.
Well, thank you for being here, and to now get started, can you share with the audience what is your form or forms of creativity?
Yeah, forms, I think, is probably the best way to put it, because it's a couple of different projects that are all sort of intertwined with one another. I guess the best way to describe what I've been working on recently is it's a series of drawings/paintings that are based off of characters and scenes and themes from an unfinished novel that I wrote a few summers ago. And that novel itself comes from an even deeper pool of inspiration that's been sort of beneath the surface of my artistic practice since about 2001. And when I was in high school, and I started on this kind of world building project, which has for quite some time, for most of my artistic career, in fact, it was kind of an undercurrent that I would work on when I had a bit of downtime and I wasn't working on my, quote, more serious projects. But in the summer of 23, it sort of swapped places, and the work which I'd been working on up to that point, which were sort of hyper-realistic oil paintings based off of video stills. I had kind of burned out on that particular body of work. I had a few shows out of it, and I sort of feel like I pushed it about as far as I possibly could. And a lot of the work which I was doing at that point was kind of spinning my wheels, and I wasn't really going anywhere with it. And so I decided that I would take a break from that, and I sort of did, without any sort of idea or reference material for what I was going to be doing, I went back to, basically Francis Bacon mode and just started drawing and painting myself, my self-portraits. I had this mirror in my studio. I was in Bushwick at the time. This is before I joined up with Chashama, about a year before. And I had this studio in Bushwick, and my studio mate had this old mirror in the space. And I think it might have been kind of an older, cheap mirror. I don't think it was exactly made properly, and it was kind of distorted. If you looked at it from a certain angle, it would sort of warp the reflection a little bit. And so I started drawing and painting myself in this distorted mirror. It ended up being a little bit Baconian in both the visual sense of it with the distortions and also just the idea of when you don't have a subject matter, you just, work on yourself. And that's what I did for maybe a month or two. Just sort of started focusing on my own image, and I used the materials that I sort of had lying around. I did a few of them in oils, but I mostly worked in charcoal on vellum. And the vellum came from about a decade before. I was in graduate school at the Pratt Institute. And during my first semester there, the school was closing down their school store. They used to have their own, I think it's called the film and video building now, but back then it was the school store. They sold stuff for all the different areas, fine art, architecture, whatever the field was, it was supposed to be sold there. But there was a Blick store opening up on the same block, and they were going to just sort of move everything over to the Blick store and shut down the school store. And so they had the most incredible clearance sale my first semester there, and I stocked up practically a lifetime worth of supplies. I bought reams and rolls of this drafting vellum that I think was meant for the architecture and industrial design students. But whenever I needed to, sketch something out, I would just grab a sheet of vellum because it was a naturally occurring resource at that point in my studio. I was never going to run out of it. So when I was going to do some of these sketches, I had a ton of charcoal just sort of lying around from my figure drawing days, and I had this vellum. And something about that particular combination, the velvety darkness of this charcoal just on top of this translucent, ghostly vellum, the delicacy of it, something about that just seemed so appealing to me when I was working on it. And then something just sort of clicked in my mind one day, and I sort of had this vision of some of these characters from this novel that I started the summer before. And the story, it's called The Vaster Conspiracy, and it's a neo-Baroque magic realist novel that takes place in this kind of underground city, this sort of pre-industrial clockwork underground city. And it's based on all based on art counterfeiting, which I think ties in nicely to some of the ideas of the Baroque, because when you look at the Baroque period, it's all so much of the art and the literature is all about this search for some sort of underlying truth beneath the various veils and layers of appearances. And for this story, I sort of came in with the idea of what if there is no kernel of truth beneath these layers of appearances, but as you pull them away, you just get another layer underneath of it, kind of like an infinite, endless onion of layer after layer after layer. But there's really nothing, there's no core of truth underneath of it. It's all just these layers of appearances, and it sort of just seem endless, one after another. And trying to move towards that core of truth is sort of a very paranoid experience, because it becomes a questioning of, is this true or not? What can actually be trusted? Can anything be trusted? And so I sort of started moving towards this idea of the main character being this art counterfeiter. And he sort of slowly starts to try to pull away these veils of appearances, and sort of becomes increasingly paranoid as the story goes on. And viewing it from his particular viewpoint, the tone changes and his perspective on things changes. At the onset of the story, he's very much focused on the surface of things. I sort of based the writing style for the first maybe 2/3 of the story on Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, and protagonist's very superficial view of everything. Everything is all about appearances and the surface of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the protagonist sort of, analyzing the superficial aspect of everything, what a painting looks like, what another character is wearing, what he himself is wearing, but he doesn't really analyze what any of this means. It's all about this sort of shining, gleaming surface. Everything is sort of gilded like this kind of Baroque frame, but there's no real analysis into why anything is the way in which it is. The question just never comes up for him. He never really tries to dig underneath the layers of appearances to get to any sort of truth. But then, as his mental state starts to sort of change throughout as the story progresses, he starts to look deeper into things, and that sort of, in a way, it changes the perspective of it. Things undergo an anamorphic shift of perspective, and that's when things start to get really interesting.
And that novel that you said you worked on then and you left it unfinished, is it finished now?
I'm still working on it. In fact, I was working on it not too long before we got on this call. I had a few ideas to. I wanted to update my draft a little bit. So I have the first draft that I wrote June, July, and a teaspoon of August of 2022. That draft is about 100,000 words.
Oh wow! So it's a lot of work you're doing.
Put a lot of work into it, and I ended up typing so feverishly trying to work on this draft that summer that I actually pulled a tendon in my wrist, and I had to wear a brace for the rest of the summer.
Oh man!
Because some sort of wires got crossed in my wrist there from the writing process, and that sort of slowed me down, and I ended up kind of burning out on that. But it came back into my mind the following summer when I burned out on my other work, and I thought, well, let's just get these two embers together and see if some larger fire can be lit from them. These two things have burned out. Maybe they can spark something new if I put them together. So I started imagining the various characters from this story. Just how did I picture them as I was in the writing process? How did they look in my mind's eye? And I try to find references and various images for that, and then would sort of Frankenstein together these kind of photo collages in Photoshop from all kinds of different sources, and then base the drawings off of those. And I did the drawings initially in just charcoal on the vellum very quickly. Mm-hmm. I worked very rapidly on these, and I would do one in maybe 11 by 17 drawing in maybe, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours or so, just very rapidly trying to put down on the vellum how I imagine this character to look.
I've seen you do a lot of work with charcoal. So all these characters, these are based out of your book, most of them or all of them?
Yeah, all of them right now are based on the book. Recently, in the past few months, I've been kind of branching out and going from characters from other stories that I've worked on from this. They're based in the same world, but they take place in different parts of this fictional world called Neath. That's the main kind of conceit for this fantasy world, is that there's no universal sense of time. The world is tidally locked to its star and doesn't rotate, or rather it rotates on the same basis as its orbit. So one orbit is one rotation. It's the same face of the planet always faces the star. So it's sort of like how the moon is to the Earth. You never see the backside of the moon because it's tidally locked to Earth. And so I just sort of took it, and this world is tidally locked to its star. And as a consequence of that, and not having any natural satellites, there's no way to tell time on a universal scale on every part of the world. There's no day-night cycle. There's no astronomical cues that could be seen everywhere. And thus, time is a cultural phenomenon. It's something which is experienced on a more personal level. Everybody has their own individual sense of time, as opposed to there being this universal standard for everyone that people are expected to live up to. And that was inspired by my own personal experience. When I was in high school, I found out that I do not have a sleep-wake cycle. I live on a very different sense of time than most of the rest of the world does. And I can induce a cycle chemically with medications and things like that. And it sort of works most of the time. But I still do feel rather detached from the way in which the rest of the world has this rhythm. And I'm just I feel like sometimes just sort of stumbling around, never really catching the beat, not really getting into the groove that everybody else seems to be accustomed to naturally. I have to do it on a very artificial sensibility.
So do you think that you would fit right into the universe that you're writing?
One likes to think so, I suppose, seeing as this timelessness was sort of inspired by my own personal ways of sort of feeling unstuck in this world. Maybe I consciously or subconsciously created a world in which I might feel a little bit more at home, being able to, have a different rhythm of things, or at least be able to find a part of the world which has a rhythm that I could settle into. Because every culture in this world has their own different way of tracking the time. There are people who live sort of in darkward parts of the world where the dark sky can be seen, who track time based on the stars, and then where the stars appear in this dark patch of sky opposite of the subsolar point. That becomes, the cycle of the different constellations in that part of the sky becomes a star cycle, and time is tracked using the stars. But there are other parts of the world that track time as a religious ritual in the burning of these sacred candles. And each candle represents a passage from the sacred text. And the entire text is read aloud as these candles, burn down and burn down and burn down one after the other. And there's another part of the world which is very, very close to the subsolar point, where it's sort of this constant bright day, and time is not really tracked in measures shorter than that of a human lifetime. Every shorter span of time other than that just seems arbitrary. It's, counting the number of times that you go to sleep and wake up is as arbitrary as counting the number of times that you sweep the floor or bake bread or wash your hair. Why track time by those means? There's no real natural correlation for it. It's arbitrary. So people in that part of the world have a very, very different sense of time, and society functions very differently than one which tracks things with rigorous clockwork based on the motion of the stars. It's there's all sorts of different ways of doing things and different significances that these different cycles that people track have. And the cross-cultural tension between the ways in which these systems kind of collide and don't really mesh with each other, that's something which I explore very much in the book. And it's something which I find very interesting on a personal level. And I think it comes across better in the text than it does in the drawing. That's something which is very difficult to establish in a still drawing, is a sense of time, because in a way each drawing is frozen in time. It's its own little sliver of the story and a little piece of the world, but it's sort of in its own sense kind of stuck outside of time. And it's a moment frozen, inside of the frame, and it's difficult to give it a sense of time. So,
and what genre would you consider your book to be a part of?
I sort of see it sitting somewhere between fantasy and magic realism.
Okay.
There are supernatural elements to the story, but they sort of lie bubbling beneath the surface of the world. It's not the kind of thing where it's not like Harry Potter where people are casting spells and things like that. people do interact with the supernatural, but it's done in such a way that there's a sense of plausible deniability for it, that these could be completely natural phenomena that are just misunderstood, or that the different characters see them through their own lens of experience and culture in such a way that to them it's something unbelievable, but to somebody else it could just be, something totally normal.
In the beginning, you were talking about getting burned out with oil paintings, and then doing your novel, then going to your charcoal drawings, and we see your growth over the years. But now I want to focus our attention on how it all started. I mean, we got into the we got well, you started pretty much with the burnout with the oil painting, but how did you get into oil painting, and what was before that and before that? So I guess to start it,
Yeah.
how did you find an interest in creativity and art in the first place?
Well, I guess it would be a bit of a cliche answer to say that I've always been interested in this sort of thing, but it's honestly that's sort of the answer.
Hmm.
Let me just think back, and as far as this project and this world, as far as those things are concerned, I can sort of trace the origin of those to when I was supposed to be going to high school, but was my sleep disorder was very much starting to flare up at that point, and I was, cutting school quite a bit of the time and working on these various projects. The first project that I did with this in this particular world was going to be a video game. I was using this software called RPG Maker to make basically a role-playing game set in this world, and I was, doing that while I was supposed to be going to school, and I would do my get my lessons sent over, for homework, and do those sort of in the afternoon and evening. But during the day, I would, wake up fairly late and work on this game for a length of time before my actual lessons started. And I did this for a number of months until my data got corrupted and I lost most of what I'd been working on at that point.
Yeah.
And it kind of got to the point where it would be more work to recover a lot of this than it would be just to start over with something else. And there were a lot of other things going on in my life at that point that, things are very complicated. And I ended up going to a culinary school for a little while. And culinary school taught me one thing, which was that I loved to cook for myself and for my family and for my friends, but I didn't really care for the atmosphere of the commercial kitchen. Mm-hmm. That was not the kind of environment where I would be, able to do what I wanted to do, at least not for, quite some time until I started to run my own kitchen, which could be, decades down the line. Mm-hmm. And when I would go to my lessons at this school, I would bring a sketchbook with me, and I would just sort of doodle some of the different, characters from what up to that point had been a game, but I was sort of trying to reimagine it as kind of a graphic novel at that time. So I started doodling these different characters, and one of my teachers saw me sketching when I was supposed to be, paying attention to a lesson in how to properly use a saute pan, and said, well, maybe you should think about art school. If this is where, your interests obviously don't lie in the culinary arts, why not branch out and look at other arts and other fields? So I transferred over to a fine arts program and started doing drawing and painting classes, the real foundational basics. We did life drawing, a number of classes on that, very basic drawing technique, painting techniques. It was all acrylic painting at that point because that particular school didn't have the facilities to do proper oil painting or ventilation or things like that. So I was working in acrylics and doing art history and doing different design classes. I did a whole semester of like web design and computer design and all this experimenting with all the different fields.
Yeah.
And I ended up becoming very much enamored with painting and the different effects that I could make, painting on canvas. And I ended up transferring to the painting program at Syracuse University as a junior, and I spent about 2 years there, and jumped into oils and didn't look back for quite some time. And I had a lot of really wonderful professors there. I don't know if any of them are still at the school. It's been, oh man, I graduated in 2008, so I don't feel like doing math right now. I'll leave it up to the viewer/listener to calculate how long that's been. But yeah, I don't think any of my former professors are still there, but they really provided me with a great deal of support, and I became very interested in seriality in art, or working in different series of things where one individual piece isn't necessarily the be-all, end-all, that it's part of a larger grouping of work, a larger series, a larger idea, that each individual piece is sort of a sliver of a larger whole. And I presented a couple of different projects. I don't know if they still do this in Syracuse, but every year the senior class would do this. They had this sort of painting competition, and there were a number of different prizes that were paid out through various funds to the different winners. And I basically showed two series of work from that in that competition. One of them was a series of paintings of stag beetles and rhinoceros beetles fighting each other in this kind of almost Francis Baconian kind of ring. And I took the inspiration from this video that I'd imported from Japan of these. It was all these beetles fighting each other. Mm-hmm. It was just sort of this compilation of the best, most intense beetle fights. And I took these screenshots from the videotape, and they were all kind of blurred and warped from the motion of the beetles being faster than the camera could possibly pick up. So sort of found these kind of frames in between of the action, and I loved the kind of the motion blur, and I loved the kind of ferocity, but also there was a kind of almost ritual aspect to these fights. It was kind of a ritual, but in an organism that seemed too undeveloped and primitive to really have a sense of why they were doing this kind of ritual. It almost seemed like sort of above their heads, but they were doing it anyway. And I found that to be very kind of compelling, sort of this, insects, when you look at them, they almost seem like these kind of little robots in a way. They don't really have advanced nervous systems to be able to process things in the way in which we do, but they still exhibit these really advanced behaviors, that, or at least behaviors that appear advanced, but may in fact be quite simple. And so that was one of the things I was exploring in this series of the Beatles. And the other series that I did was a series of portraits of basically I found this magazine, and it was like a photo shoot, magazine with different models in it. And this one particular model had 25 shots in this particular magazine. So I did one portrait for each shot of her in the magazine. And that was I like the idea of the series being kind of self-limiting, that, there were 25 photos in this publication. I'll just do one portrait. Even there are some which she has her back to the camera. So I just sort of did these portraits of the back of her head, and they were all the same size. They were all the same color palette, all the same, everything was identical except for the angle of her head and her expression and things like the lighting and things like that. Those are all variable from image to image, but the format was the same for them. And I liked the variation within this armature of regularity. That I found that to be very compelling. And I liked the self-limiting nature of it, that we had these, 25 images, and that was this universe. That was what we had to work with. That was our raw material. And once we were done with that, that was a series. It had its own boundaries kind of built right into it. It already had its borders, and we were just sort of exploring the territory within those borders.
We see in your timeline, you're starting off going to culinary arts, culinary school. You're a great cook, but you don't want to be doing commercial cooking.
Right.
Fortunately, someone kind of directs you to towards the arts, and you start doing your stuff there. I wanted to pause for a moment because you mentioned Francis Bacon and how he was influential for you, especially in the beginning of this interview. You mentioned how uh, like the self portraits and things like that, it kind of had a impact. I wanted to pause there real quick and ask you, like, how or what was it about Francis Bacon that uh, influenced your artistic style?
Interesting question, because when you look at the work which I'm doing today, and you look at a painting by Francis Bacon, you would be really next to no correlation between the two. But I find that my own process relies pretty heavily on things like randomness and things like sort of making marks and sort of seeing where the image wants to go based on the direction implied by those particular marks, or just a smudge on the paper. If I smear the charcoal in a certain way, this creates kind of a feeling, and then how do I build off of that feeling to not only make an image that has a certain amount of intensity and a certain kind of sensation, which is what I think Bacon said that he was after. It was not necessarily, well, he used the term illustrative very pejoratively in his interviews. All the art which he didn't like, he called illustration, and he described that as art which doesn't necessarily work on the level of physical sensation, but works on the intellect first. That it's art that sort of one has to view and intellectualize before one is able to see it or feel it on a more visceral kind of level. And he at least claimed, I don't really trust Bacon's words at all. The man was a pathological liar, but he claimed in his interviews that he was going for a more visceral level of sensation in his work, trying to make work that acts on the nervous system before one is able to actually sense it on a rational, intellectual level. You feel it in your body before you see it with your mind, and that's what he was going for. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily what I'm going for in this particular work. I'm not trying to make something that gives a visceral shock before one can process it. But I do also get the sense that maybe there is some of that at work, that working in such a manner where I'm very open to chance and very open to, having the drawing not necessarily go as I'd imagined it, but go off in a different direction. And maybe it doesn't end up resembling this character at all. Maybe I have to sort of, figure out, is this, this person, or is this somebody else? Or is this just a different way of seeing this particular character? Maybe this is a different side of them, which I hadn't quite expected to see. Maybe it's sort of taking off in its own direction. And I think, working with the Baroque allows for a lot of that kind of improvisation, because there's so much very minute detail on everything. And from a distance, a lot of these, the drawings look very ornate and put together, but the detail work, if you look very closely at them, is actually just random. I have this battery-powered eraser that erases in this kind of very shaky, random motion. And I like to use that to sort of build up. I'll build up layers of charcoal and chalk and pastel and things like that, and then erase them back with this kind of random motion from the eraser, and then build up other areas, where it's a little bit darker, maybe I'll accentuate that darkness, and where it's lighter, maybe I'll erase away some of the lightness and put some gouache on top of it. And sort of build up these patterns out of this underlying sense of randomness. So in a way, it's a little bit like our world, where we have this layer of kind of quantum randomness underpinning everything, but that's not necessarily visible in our day-to-day lives. We see a very orderly, for the most part, universe with our eyes, but underneath all of that is this entire universe within the universe, where everything is, basically a roll of a dice or a flip of a coin. Everything is, based on randomness and probabilities, as opposed to things that are necessarily predictable.
But in your art, particularly your charcoal art, would you say that there's a lot of randomness or order there, chaos?
I like to think that it's the appearance of order, but the order that comes from an underlying chaos. When I start one of these, I have an image that I want to achieve, and I have this kind of map that I put together in Photoshop of how I want to go about achieving it. And maybe that gives me the broad outlines of what I want to put, where I want to put things on the page. But I leave my drawing process very open, and things, mutate pretty heavily throughout the drawing process. And especially on the larger works where I might have multiple characters, or I have a character in a very detailed setting, these change quite a bit throughout the drawing process. And one of the benefits of working on vellum is that it's very erasable. Okay. It can tolerate erasure very, very well, and you can erase it down to the raw surface, pretty easily without damaging the paper terribly much. Mm-hmm. So I can go back and make corrections without, as many times as I want, really, unless I go, way too far with it. Yeah. Then that's a disadvantage of the vellum is that it's very strong against things like erasure, but it's very, very weak with things like, tearing. So I have to be extremely careful. And especially with some of the larger pieces, if I happen to touch the paper wrong, or maybe my hand catches on it as I'm drawing something, and it can potentially rip. And I've lost a few large pieces to some of these rips I wasn't able to patch up, and it's very frustrating. You put in so many hours of trying to get this drawing where you want it to go, and then suddenly you're careless for just one little moment, but that's all it takes. Just take that one little moment, and then the corner of the paper comes clean off. And I remember there was one of these. I spent maybe a week on this drawing, and then just one day the corner comes off, and that's that. I had to scrap it.
And how do you choose the subjects for your drawings?
Well, one thing which I do, I'm always reading and rereading the various versions of this manuscript, not only as I very slowly and gradually work on my rewrites. I'll go back and read what I already have and see, how can I make this better? How can I, add in new things, new ideas that I come up with, and how can I mesh that into this? How can I, stitch it into the fabric of what I already have? And so as I, read through what I have, I sort of cut ideas and new images sort of, come across as I imagine these scenes. And I think, well, this might make for an interesting, painting. I haven't shown this character yet. Why don't I imagine what he or she looks like? And usually what I'll start out with is a smaller sketch, a smaller scale study, sort of trying to iterate through and sort of see, what does this character look like? How do they interact with the world? What is their, sensibility? What kind of expressions do they have? Things like that. And once I sort of flesh that out, then I'll think, okay, what kind of settings does this person inhabit? What kind of environments? Where would this character be at home? For example, I have this one piece I did last year of a very complex character who is both an astronomer and a priestess from a foreign religion. And I sort of put her in the environment of her study, which has, a map of the world next to a map of the stars, and she has a pile of books with names in all different languages from around the world. She has a teacup overflowing with half-burned cigarette butts, and smoking a cigarette in the while the portrait is being done. And she has a half-written letter on her writing desk with an inkwell next to it, but there's no pen. So I wanted to you sort of use the environment and some of these props as a way to sort of tell part of the story, but also tell it in a way which isn't necessarily an illustration of the text. That I'm basing it off of a scene from the book, but I'm not illustrating the entire scene. I'm the sense of illustration, it doesn't necessarily mesh one-to-one of what's in the script, in the manuscript. Or there's another drawing that I did based on a scene from a bar with the character sort of passed out in the banquette. And in the manuscript, it says that she has 5 empty glasses in front of her. In the drawing, I only put 4. And that was an intentional little way of subverting the text and not necessarily illustrating everything that's in my manuscript, but sort of letting the drawings kind of go off in their own direction. And I thought, well, 5 just doesn't really fit on the table very well. I kind of thought that 4 was enough glasses, and 5 would have been kind of overwhelming for the space. So I thought, well, I'm not, I could always change the text to match the picture if I wanted to. But in a way, I kind of liked that disconnect as well. If I were to exhibit this drawing with, maybe a page from the manuscript next to it, and that would sort of raise the question, okay, this says there's 5 glasses, this only shows 4. The handwritten letter, nowhere in the text does ever say the letter was on the table. It was given by the bartender to the main character. So why is there a letter on the table here? All these little incongruencies between the image and the text that either build up accidentally, and I sort of, try to, take credit for that, or I intentionally had them as incongruencies just to, play with the source material and sort of try to tease out something else, from it than what's necessarily in the text or on the paper.
What is it that you love most about your manuscripts and your drawings?
That's a good question. I mean, I've had these characters kind of rattling around in my head and on the page, and both in the textual as well as a visual sensibility for so long. It's hard to really play favorites with them. There are a few characters I've depicted more than most. I've done quite a few drawings of the main character, the art counterfeiter, Vester Vrain. As a protagonist, he's sort of the one who I maybe feel a bit closer to than the others, because I've sort of tried to inhabit his viewpoint and see things in his perspective for so long that maybe parts of myself sort of rub off on the character, or parts of the character kind of rub off on me. But this particular character, he has his origins come from a number of different sources. I've always been a huge fan of David Lynch for years and years and years. I remember back when Twin Peaks was on TV, I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I remember sneaking downstairs at night. My dad was a big Twin Peaks fan. He would always watch it on TV, and I would sort of be watching from the stairs this, show that I was not allowed to see because it was too weird. But I would, catch, glimpses of it here and there, some of the weirdness of it all. And then I started watching, Lynch's cinema when I was in college, and Blue Velvet has always been one of my favorite films in general, but certainly one of my favorite films of Lynch's, just for the way in which I think it meshes with my own personal aesthetic very well, because there's so much of the world which lies beneath the surface, and Lynch illustrates this absolutely beautifully right from the outset of the film, where you have this montage to the song, Blue Velvet, of these roses next to the white picket fence. You have this, vintage 50s fire truck going down the lane. You have the children crossing the road going to school, and then you have this beautifully manicured lawn. And then he zooms in to this lawn so close. You have a blade of grass, taking up most of the frame, and then underneath that you have these beetles and you have these ants, and they're just sort of fighting and they're killing each other underneath this beautifully manicured lawn. And that, I feel, really sums up the film very perfectly. And it also sums up my own view of things, this idea that you can't really trust the appearances of things. So there's always some deeper layer of things. Even if it's just another layer of appearances, there's still something hidden beneath that, which you can peel back and go a little bit deeper. So I've always loved Blue Velvet, and of the whole film, I think my personal favorite scene is the scene where you have this character of Ben who's lip syncing the song "In Dreams" by Roy Orbison to the villain character of Frank Booth, who up to that point has been this complete and utter psychopath with no real sense of ethics or morality, who is exhibiting this wild and unhinged behavior. And at that point, you sort of have, as he listens to this song, he sort of tears up and becomes very emotional, but not necessarily in a psychopathic way, but in a much more tender way as he's listening to this song. And that just sort of got me thinking, okay, what is it about this particular song which cuts through all of the scar tissue, all those levels of psychopathy within this character to sort of hit on that last little ember of tenderness left within him. And that was where I think this character of Vaster kind of found his origin, was in my, very deeply thinking about that particular scene and how, what could it be that this character has underneath the surface, which is being struck by the music and by the lyrics and by the performance, and that is sort of where this character came from. What is, this art counterfeiter sort of covering up with these layers of criminality and degeneracy and substance abuse? What is at the core of this? And, what is, that little, life-giving spark underneath all these layers of trauma and grief?
How do you see your creative universe evolving? Do you see yourself perhaps going back to RPG at some point, or maybe making a film? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've played with the idea of making video games, especially during the pandemic, where the art world was pretty well shuttered, at least in New York. And I was editing for an arts publication at that time, and there wasn't much to write about, so there wasn't much for me to edit. So I had a bit of free time, so I started bouncing. I knew I didn't have the resources at the time to make the kind of sprawling, epic that I had originally conceived of when I was a teenager. But I thought, well, what about a short, the game equivalent of a short story? And so I came up with a number of ideas. I sort of, drafted a number of ideas for short stories that could be set in this same world, but could be maybe a puzzle game or an adventure game or a visual novel that could be done, that could be played through. A playthrough could maybe take an hour or two, and it could be, done with hand-drawn graphics, scanned in and digitized, and it could be turned around fairly quickly. So I came with a couple of ideas, and that's sort of the idea of sort of just coming up with these, shorter stories. That's what sort of led to the art counterfeiting story. That was one of the ones that I came up with in this sort of initial surge of coming up with ideas. One of the ideas was based on this book by a French author, Xavier de Maistre. It was called A Voyage Around My Room. And basically this French aristocrat had been put under house arrest for dueling. And during the 40 days he was under house arrest, he wrote this kind of memoir of his time spent just sort of living in his room and sort of living off of his own daydreams and fantasies. And so I had this idea, why don't we superimpose that into my world, and we could have this character who the game's kind of conceit was that the player only has control over this character's daydreams and fantasies. All of the stuff that takes place in the real world is scripted according to the decisions that the player makes in the character's imagination. So it's sort of, in a way, it's kind of reverse from how one might expect it. One might expect to have control over the real world, but have the fantasies to sort of go off on their own and sort of not really have much agency over them. But I decided maybe it would be more interesting if that were flipped, that the player has control over the realm of fantasy, but the world of reality is sort of beyond, any sort of conscious control or reach. And the other idea I had was for a kind of a adventure game / puzzle game that would involve 3 main characters that could be sort of switched between, and they were all priestesses of the same religion, the enshrinement of Lucca that I mentioned earlier. And the puzzles were all these mysterious reliquaries that showed up at the shrine mysteriously, and had to be unlocked. And depending on how many of the player unlocked and how the solutions to the puzzles were found, new puzzles would emerge, new characters would show up, and the story would go off in all these different directions. And so I think for each one of these ideas, it sort of spiraled away from being, okay, I can do this if I, do so many drawings per day and, come up with these different ideas. They started out being very reasonable, doable propositions and very quickly spiraled away from that. And the novel had the same sort of origin. It started out as a short story based on, essentially, I based the whole art counterfeiting idea on the time I spent when I had just got out of undergrad. I worked in the archives at Knoedler and Gallery Company in New York for a while. And they were the oldest art gallery in New York. They were right a few doors down from the Frick collection on 70th Street between 5th and Madison. And in fact, I used to take my lunch breaks at the Frick. I could get in there with my old student ID for free and just sort of spend my lunch break. I would look at a number of the paintings there. And those inspire me to this day, the Ang and the Bellini and the 3 Vermeers. But the idea for this story came from Knoedler because secretly, I only found this out years after the fact, after I'd left already, that they were selling counterfeit paintings under the table secretly. And that was the only thing that was keeping the gallery in business, for the sales of these counterfeits. And I had no idea this was going on. I was just sort of, stuck up upstairs in the archives, going through books and papers, all day, sort of off in my own little world, detached from the rest of the gallery's affairs. But I was sort of fascinated by that idea of this kind of, criminality, kind of, keeping this institution going in a sense, because Knoedler was very much, this storied old institution. It was the last thing that anybody thought would be, trying to move fakes around. Yeah. And some of them were quite good fakes. The way that they got found out, I find this absolutely fascinating, was the forger that was supplying the forgeries to the gallery was quite good, but he messed up one time. He was forging a Jackson Pollock, and he used a pigment that hadn't been invented while Pollock was alive. This pigment was invented after Pollock's death, but he used it in the piece that was being passed on to Pollock. And so I guess one of the collectors had suspicions about the authenticity of the work. So this is all just sort of going from what I've heard. They went and got the painting tested by conservators or something, and they tested the various pigments that were found in different parts of the painting, and they found the one pigment that hadn't been invented while Pollock was alive. So that sent the whole house of cards just tumbling down. And there were lawsuits. The gallery had to close. They had to sell the archive. The archive is at the Getty now in Los Angeles. And so at least it was preserved, because that archive was something else. Wow. I don't know what happened to collection of catalogs and books. I think that got sold as well, but I'm not sure if it was bought by an institution or just like sold off to the Strand or something. I really have no idea. But they had like auction catalogs for every auction that's ever gone on in New York. They had just stacks and stacks and stacks of all these incredible books. And for somebody who, two of my main loves in life are art and books.
Yeah.
And that was the perfect intersection of it. And I have so many great memories of, being in that place of all the really interesting and wonderful people who worked there. And, but it also provided, after the fact, provided the inspiration for the story. And I intended for it to just sort of be a short story, maybe a few thousand words. I could get thrown into a magazine or something.
Yeah.
And then 100,000 words later, oh heck, this kind of spiraled away from my original vision a little bit, didn't it?
What is your favorite RPG game?
There's so many good ones. I'll say Final Fantasy VI. I played it on the Super Nintendo right when it came out back in, was it 94 or 95, I think. And I play it, to this day. It's
You still have the Super Nintendo?
It's not exactly working at the moment, but I do still have it.
Oh man, cool.
Mostly I just play it on emulator so I can use save states and things like that to save time and not have to, because I think the battery in my cartridge died like decades ago. So can't really save on the original cartridge anymore. But I do still have it. It's here at my mom's house in my bedroom here. So I have the Super Nintendo. I got the game. But what I love about it is that I feel like, all the character designs of the first 6 Final Fantasy games were done by the Japanese illustrator Yoshitaka Amano. And in fact, he has a show up right now in New York at Lomax Gallery, which is incredible. I was able to get in and see that the other week. It's really, really incredible drawings and prints in that show. But the work he did for the Final Fantasy games really defined the visual style. And I think that number 6 is so much the perfect encapsulation of his vision, but within the affordances of the hardware and software at the time. It couldn't be this. You couldn't have the same sort of swirling neo-Baroque sensibility of his work, but you could only really have so many pixels on the screen at once. It was very much limited by the hardware, but I feel like Final Fantasy VI was the perfect expression of his vision, given the limitations of the platform they were having to work on.
Okay, my next question for you is, what would you say is your favorite movie of all time?
Oh, favorite movie of all time. That's a tough one. Honestly, my favorite anything changes from day to day. I've got to go with Blue Velvet, though. I think that's been, or anything of Lynch's. I recently watched Mulholland Drive again, and that could definitely be a favorite. Yeah. That has so many incredible, the dream-like atmosphere of so much of the film, and this kind of dreams within dreams within dreams. This kind of, these dreams kind of nesting inside of each other like nesting dolls. I've had that experience myself, where you wake up from a dream and you're not awake, you're in another dream.
Yeah.
It seems like there's no escaping this kind of dream world, and that's come into play in a number of my stories, including the novel as well as the game I was telling you about, with the main characters sort of living in this realm of fantasy. You have these fantasies nested within fantasies, and I feel like so much of that can sort of cycle back to Lynch and his really kind of spot on manner of sort of emulating the logic and the we can't really call it realism of dreams, because there really is no realism of dreams, but if there is, he's probably the one to approach it the most closely. He sort of, so much of the narratives in his films, and also in Twin Peaks, I suppose, and his TV work as well, really latches on to that internal logic of the dream, where it makes perfect sense while you're asleep. While you're asleep and dreaming, everything makes sense within the internal logic of the dream. But then once you wake up, you think, what kind of bizarre heck was any of this? Why was I dreaming of any of that bizarre stuff? But at the time, it made perfect sense. And I feel like that, Lynch plays with that so incredibly well in his work. And Blue Velvet, I think, is one of his less overtly bizarre films. It has its moments. It has its moments where it's something possibly supernatural kind of bubbles up from under the surface, but then it sort of quenches itself and goes back into plausibility. And I feel like those moments where it's very understated like that, I think it's all the more powerful for that, because it has different explanations, for the same phenomena. And so much can be sort of spun off of just that kind of thinking. That's one of the engines that drove my initial inspiration for the novel, was some of these weirder scenes from Blue Velvet. And that's what inspired my protagonist, one of the several aspects of my protagonist.
My next question for you, is there like a favorite go-to place or favorite activity that you like to do to help spark an inspiration during the creative process?
Sometimes I feel like just being in a studio space. Who was it? I think it might have been Chris Burden who said that everything that you do in your studio is art. Even if it's just sort of sitting in your chair, having your lunch, and reading a book or something, that's as much of an artistic pursuit as it actually, working on a drawing or a painting, or maybe it's just you're just stretching canvases all day. That's as much of part of the artistic process as anything else. And so just being in a creative space like that, I think, definitely helps. And I haven't been back to my actual studio in some time, unfortunately. But even just sort of, I have this, I sort of took over my mother's study in her house and sort of turned that into my studio in exile, if you will. And that's sort of just being in this space is, sort of set aside from the rest of the world. And it's sort of I've turned it into my space where I can, envision things and, have my work up on the walls and, make new things. Recently, I've been getting a lot more into pen and ink. I started collecting fountain pens a few months ago. And I've been, sort of using those in my artistic process as opposed to just, the charcoal and and gouache as well. All the highlights on my drawings are done in opaque white gouache on top of the translucent paper, so they just sort of pop out like that. And there's a story behind that which I can get to if we have time later. But recently, I've been working with the pen and ink quite a bit and really loving the immediacy of the ink. That it's and the permanency of it. It's very difficult to go back and undo something. Working on the vellum with the charcoal, if I make a mark that I don't particularly care for, if I get a smudge on the paper or something, I can go back with different erasers and try to undo that. I can, Command Z and undo what I just did and try again. But with the ink, you put something on the paper, the dyes and the ink, bind directly to the fibers of the paper. There's no going back. It's on there. And you either work with what you have or you try to find another direction for it, or you just toss it out and start over. And if you've been working on something for a couple of hours like that, you don't want to start over on it. You want to, maybe there's a stray mark on the paper and now you have to make something out of that and see where things go from there. So it's been an interesting development, I think, in my creative process, working with the ink more often.
What would you say would be your favorite art supply or art tool?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, at the moment, maybe the fountain pens. I mean, I feel like that's sort of opened up a whole new immediacy in my, a different kind of connection between the hand and the surface and the image that I hadn't really explored before. So I would say probably the pens are, and the whole universe of different colors and sheens and whatever of the different inks you can get. That's its whole world in itself. So much I have yet to explore in all of that. So for the moment, that's sort of my tool of choice. But the other work that I've been doing, I think, different black and white monochrome kind of materials like charcoal or black drawing chalk or pastels, different things that can be moved around the paper with my fingers or with a brush or with blending stubs and things like that that can move around the paper and blend into each other. And each one has its own different properties, its own texture, its own sense of darkness and sense of light when you erase out of it, its own very unique properties. And I feel like mixing all of those together on the surface of the paper, it's kind of a joy every time everything sort of mixes up right together, just kind of meshes into something. It's like when you cook a really good stew. You put in all the ingredients, you brown the meat and you deglaze the fond with a little bit of red wine or some stock or something, and everything. You cook it down, you put the lid on it to simmer it, and you take the lid off and you reduce it down. And then everything just reduces down at the perfect rate, and the potatoes mush up a little bit to give it a little bit of texture, and everything just sort of congeals into the perfect final product. And I feel like when you really hit on that, in not only in a stew but also in a drawing, where all the materials are sort of working to their advantages and everything kind of meshes together so beautifully. It's a wonderful moment when you see that, and that's when I sort of know that it's done. You sort of get that sense that if I leave this on the burner for any longer, it's going to scorch.
Are there any other artists, either upcoming or maybe they've already been well into their creative careers? Any other creators out there whom you suggest we watch out for?
How long do you have? I mean, there's so many people who have inspired me, and it's really difficult to answer that one. There's so many possibilities. A good friend of mine, Daniel Giordano, has a museum show coming up at I think it's St. Thomas Aquinas College upstate a little ways. That's opening in March, I believe. I just found out about this the other day, and his work is very, very much more in the realm of sculpture. Mine's very much in the realm of drawing and painting. But I feel like he has this kind of really strong neo-Baroque sensibility about his work that's very much tied into his own autobiography and the sense of place where he works in the town of Newburgh, very much tied to history and setting, and the materiality of everything is so incredibly strong, but everything has been processed in some fashion. He transforms his raw materials into this kind of alchemical practice that I just find absolutely fascinating. And I've written about his work before, and I've seen so many of his shows, and he's a really good friend. And I definitely, once more details about the show are released, I would definitely recommend that people, venture upstate and check it out.
Now, my question that I ask every guest is, why is creativity important for you?
Very good question. I guess it's sort of the question you could also ask of a fish: why is water important to you? It's just sort of the environment in which I live. I don't really, know much else. It's like, it would be like, having me go into a field which doesn't involve any creativity at all would be sort of like asking a fish to sort of, grow lungs and, walk on land. Or if I do have to go into an environment which isn't necessarily creative, I can find ways to make it creative. I can find a way to interact with that environment, of that world, in such a way that I can make it hospitable to myself. It's a little bit like wearing a spacesuit or something. It's like, but yeah, maybe there's always this kind of bubble of creativity around me, of, because you never know when an idea is going to hit you. You never know when you're going to see something or hear something, or maybe it's just a snippet of conversation that you hear over here in the coffee shop, and the way in which somebody's talking that strikes something in you. And maybe you think, oh, maybe I could have a character who talks like that. Maybe this particular, maybe there's a particular word that somebody says that you want to work into something. Or maybe there's an image that you see somewhere, the way in which the light hits something, or the way in which a particular room is set up that you want to work into a drawing or into a scene for in a book or something like that. You never know when something is going to strike you. So I think it's always important to have that, be immersed in that bubble of creativity around you, so you can be open to seeing these things when you encounter them. And maybe you won't immediately know when something's going to be important or not. But eventually, you'll cycle back to something like that, like I did with the art counterfeiting in the gallery I worked at. I didn't really think consciously about that for years, but then for whatever reason, the stars aligned and something kind of hit me with that, and that sparked hundreds of thousands of words and dozens of drawings so far, and who knows what else could spin off of that. There's all sorts of new and exciting directions that can go. So it's just about staying open to ideas and experiences and seeing where those take you.
Awesome. So thank you so much for being here on the podcast. And for those who are listening and they want to find out more about you, where can they go?
Well, I have a website. It's romankalinovski.com, and I have most of my drawings on there, and the drawings are presented with excerpts from the manuscript next to them. So whether it's more information about the various characters or the description of a particular scene, I pair up the drawings with excerpts from the manuscripts on the site, so you can sort of see them side by side and see sort of where might have been inspired by, or what it might be getting informed from. So that's on my website. I'm also on Instagram. My handle is @Kalinova, KLINOVA 828. And I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Threads. Should all be the same username. Pretty universal across platforms.
Okay, Roman, well, thank you so much for being here on Creativity Worth Expressing. And for those in the audience, make sure to like, to subscribe, and please share this episode so that other people may encounter the amazing and awesome creative universe presented by our guest today, Roman Kalinowski. And again, Roman, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute blast.